Hi everybody, all the books I'll be discussing will be here on the screen and they'll also be timestamped in the description below. The first book I have to talk about is Hyperion by Dan Simmons. This was selected for me from Matt on Books for our Fireside Discord TBR swap. I got chills in the opening line of this book when the console character is in a spaceship and he's playing on the piano Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C sharp minor. I love that piece, and I was listening to that piece a week or two before I picked up the book. I even played it in my Instagram stories for my last wrap-up, so I got chills when I read that opening line. This book is considered a lot of people's favorite science fiction book of all time. I loved the existential dread that I felt throughout the story. We are dealing with the brink of intergalactic war in the future. There are 7 characters who are brought together for this pilgrimage on the planet Hyperion, a planet that's very mysterious for its time tombs and mysterious shrike creature. And we don't know exactly why these particular 7 characters are brought together, but the number 7 is very important. It says explicitly in the text that there needs to be a prime number for this pilgrimage. So this is somewhat of a framed narrative in that the framed part are these characters coming together, meeting each other, and then each of them tells their stories. So we go into each character's stories. So it's kind of like a collection of stories. It's been compared to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And I don't know if I'm onto something or if I'm way off base with this because there are a lot of questions left unanswered by the end of the book. And this is book 1 in a series. I felt like a common theme I felt throughout the storylines had to do with a crisis of faith or a sense of feeling like characters were out of alignment or at odds with the lives they've devoted themselves to. There was some sort of dissonance there, and this is all happening at the same time that humankind is going through a huge upheaval. There's a lot of AI in the story, so I think there's a question as to whether humanity is worth it or not, worth saving or not. And each of these storylines were interesting. They were very unique. I liked some more than others, so I'll briefly go through the various storylines without any spoilers. So we get the storyline of a priest, and it's a priest telling the story of another priest in an epistolary first-person narration format through letters, and I loved that storyline. That was my favorite. I felt like there was so much symbolism in that storyline, and I could just feel the emotional weight that this character was grappling with the strange occurrences that happen. And then the second storyline deals with a soldier with maybe wish fulfillment gone weird, if I could put it that way. I don't want to say more than that. And then the third storyline deals with a poet who has, I would say, a meta role in the story. And then the next storyline deals with a scholar who's maybe the most innocent of his circumstances, but this scholar, he has a very tragic circumstance involving his daughter. And then the next storyline, it has to do with a detective who has a client who's a cybrid character. I didn't care for that storyline as much, but it does have important plot reveals and literary allusions to John Keats and his poetry. And then the last storyline has to do with the console character, the character who opens the book. And I won't say anything about that storyline because I think that is a fascinating reveal when you get there. So as I mentioned, I enjoyed some storylines more than others. I specifically loved the priest the most. I did enjoy Dan Simmons' writing style. He loves to insert literary allusions. It's littered with literary allusions throughout the story. In addition to Canterbury Tales and John Keats, there were references to Beowulf and also music references, as I mentioned, such as Rachmaninoff and Wagner. And I thought that choice was very interesting, especially as we have left old Earth behind and we are on to this new era of humankind and with big question marks as to where it's going. I think a lot of people find this first book somewhat unsatisfying as it is book 1 in a series and there are a lot of questions unanswered, as I mentioned, but I actually felt pretty satisfied with this book as a standalone. I didn't think I would, but I actually do, and I'm not feeling urgency to continue. I will, though. I promised Matt from Matt on Books I would continue this series, and I will get to Fall of Hyperion at some point, but I don't feel like I'm in an immediate rush to do so, and that's probably a good thing for me because I have so many series on my TBR right now, and I haven't done a good job closing out series this year, with the exception of one I'll be mentioning soon in this video. Now, since I just mentioned finishing out series, I might as well go ahead and talk about Return to Edan by Philip Chase. I finished this book in the month of June, but I'm not going to talk about this in depth here because I already hosted a long discussion on this book here on my channel. In fact, I've hosted discussions on all 3 books in the Edan trilogy. I also did spoiler-free reviews of book 1 and 2. So I will direct you to my Return to Edan discussion. There are spoiler-free thoughts at the beginning, and that discussion was with Philip Chase, the author, Murphy Napier, Tom Orange, and John from Talking Story. So that was a lot of fun to talk with them about this book, and it was great to celebrate my friend for finishing his first epic fantasy series, which is a major accomplishment. One more thing I want to mention about the Edan trilogy is I've sometimes heard it being compared to John Gwynn's writing style, and I couldn't quite see it at first because the Edan trilogy is traditional fantasy. It is a farm boy exiled going on a quest. There is an elf in the story. There are dwarves who are called dwergs. There are dragons. So I could see it as being a very traditional fantasy story, but there are also Eastern influences in the books as well. Especially in books 1 and 2, I was more drawn into the Eastern influences of those books. And so that's why I couldn't quite see the comparison. And I've only read The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne, so keep that in mind. I have not continued this trilogy yet. But after reading book 3 in the Edan trilogy, Return to Edan, somehow I could see that comparison a lot more. I know Janie Wirtz has often said that too. She's often said that fans of John Gwynne will enjoy Philip Chase. And I can, for some reason, see that a lot easier now. The references he's drawing from or the inspiration he's drawing from, as well as the emphasis on battle scenes. So I actually think it's worth a shot if you enjoy John Gwynne, maybe give the Edan trilogy a try. Some of you may have watched my mid-year freakout tag, which I live streamed with Alan from the Library of Alexandria. Took place over 2 days or 2 nights because we couldn't get through all the questions in one stream. But I did modify some of the questions in the tag, including the first question I took from Books and Lala's version, which is how has your reading year been going so far? And then I also modified the question about, I think, favorite sequel. I asked favorite short story as an alternative, and I got that from a channel I recently discovered called The Active Mind. He reads a lot of interesting modern fiction as well as classics. I really enjoy that channel, and I think that those questions were great to bring up because in both of those I ended up talking about how I've been reading so much more shorter fiction this year. That's a little bit of a departure for me personally. I mean, I've still been reading a lot of tomes, but I have been reading more short stories and a lot of shorter fiction, and June was no exception because in the month of June, I read 2 short stories side by side. I read Stephen King's On Slide and Road, which is from his new collection, You Like It Darker, and Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man Is Hard to Find. And the reason I chose those 2 short stories is because I saw a fantastic analysis video on Hannah's Books comparing these 2 short stories side by side because the Stephen King short story On Slide and Road is a tribute to Flannery O'Connor. I did save watching all of Hannah's videos until I finished reading the stories for myself and came to my own conclusions, but I also really appreciated listening to what Hannah had to say, so I'll link that video below in case you're interested. But I was also excited to do this because not only was I in a Stephen King mood, but also I have been wanting to get to Flannery O'Connor for some time. Flannery O'Connor is known as being a Southern Gothic writer. She approached some very difficult, triggering material in her stories, but she did so with purpose. And I know that her stories are sometimes, or I've heard one person compare them to Cormac McCarthy and how bleak and dark they get. They're very different otherwise, though. They do explore Southern Gothic culture. And so the style is very blatant and raw and deceptively simple. I say deceptively simple because I read On Slide and Road and I was surprised with what I found in that story. So first of all, the story, it follows a dysfunctional family on a road trip. The central figure is a grandmother character. Her son, a grown son, is driving. His wife is in the passenger seat. And then the 2 grandchildren, a boy and girl, are in the backseat with the grandmother. The grandmother also brings along a cat. And then things get very, very dark. The story has such a fascinating ending, too. And my mother got excited when she heard I was reading Flannery O'Connor. She's a big fan. She told me to call her after I finished this story. We spoke for over an hour about that short story. There was so much to discuss as far as the subtext and the symbolism and so many foreshadowing elements in the story, things that I completely missed. So this is a story that really, really requires close reading to get the most out of it. So after reading that, I read the Stephen King short story On Slide and Road, and I had my mother read that as well. And I was afraid my mother would not enjoy the Stephen King version because it's not nearly as in-depth as the Flannery O'Connor one. We both enjoyed it though. We both enjoyed King's tribute to Flannery O'Connor. In King's version, it's a dysfunctional family, and rather than the grandmother being a central figure, it's a grandfather. I love King's characterization in this story. I love how he depicted this grandfather. I thought it was very entertaining. It takes a very different turn than Flannery O'Connor's story, but I still loved it, and I love that he paid tribute to O'Connor, and my mother felt the same way. We appreciated the story and King doing what King does. One of the many things I love that King does is the way that he writes family dynamics in general, so I thought he did such a great job with his own interpretation of the story. It's set in more modern times. So I highly recommend, if you've read On Slide and Road, if you've read the King story though, read the Flannery O'Connor one, because I think that you'll get so much more out of the King story if you read the Flannery O'Connor one. And if you read the Flannery O'Connor one and you like Stephen King, you might enjoy On Slide and Road. I know Hannah wasn't as crazy about the King version, but I loved it. But I'm already a King fan, so what can I say? I do want to read more Flannery O'Connor, so if you have any suggestions, let me know in the comment section below. And I do plan to read more Stephen King later this year. While on the topic of short stories, in the month of June, I finished The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories by Ken Liu. I read this alongside Kyle, Bookborn, and Evie. They were rereading this collection, but it was my first time reading this collection. And the stories range from science fiction to magical realism and the overall umbrella term of speculative fiction. And sometimes the sci-fi stories in here are compared to Black Mirror, the show on Netflix, because they explore the dark implications or negative implications of technology on the future of mankind. So if you enjoy those kinds of explorations, you might enjoy some of the stories in here. Though I would say the stories in the Paper Menagerie tend to be a little more fantastical, which I think you can get away with a little more in the written word than on screen. And what I loved about the sci-fi and fantastical elements of these stories is how they were all in service to the themes that Ken Liu was exploring. One of those themes being story itself, how it's passed down historically, what constitutes a story or what constitutes a book, and additionally, cultural identity, specifically intersectionality of Asian cultures, Chinese, Japanese, Taiwanese, and also collective cultures. So Asian cultures tend to be collective in their mindset versus individualist cultures like the US, where we're very self-centric. And I didn't feel like there was bias in that cultural exploration, but I love the way it was explored through each of these stories using, again, the sci-fi elements and the fantastical elements. I would universally recommend this collection because the writing style is very accessible, they're very easy to consume, but they don't sacrifice thematic impact in being accessible. Now, some stories are more poetic than others. I think Ken Liu indulges in a little bit of wordplay here and there, but for the most part, they're very easy to read. And yet I really appreciated every single one. I did find some stories more impactful than others, some just emotionally hit more than others. And the ones I preferred tended to be ones in first-person narration for whatever reason. I also think that Ken Liu is a master of inserting irony in his stories. Now, sometimes that irony was very overt and sometimes it was a little more subtle, but I love the way he did that. And I love the way that these stories get you to think about history, they get you to think about culture, they get you to think about your role as a human being on this planet and where we're going and all of these important questions. So I think that they're universal, even though they do explore a lot with Asian culture specifically. In the month of June, I read Happy Place by Emily Henry. This was my first Emily Henry novel. This was published in 2023. Very popular, very hyped book. It's a contemporary romance, and this is a genre I don't read often. It's not a genre I cover a lot here on the channel, though I have enjoyed my time reading contemporary romance in the past. This involves a girl named Harriet who is so excited. She's so thrilled, enthusiastic to get off the plane and go meet her friends in Maine for a week-long vacation at her friend's parents' estate. So it's going to be an all-girls besties vacation. She's going to have the best time. And then, lo and behold, she sees her fiance, except he's her ex-fiance. They broke up 5 months ago and haven't told anyone. They didn't tell any of their family, none of their friends, and yet they decide to continue pretending they're together because one of the friends announces that the reason that she brought them all together is because she's getting married at the end of the week. So they don't want to sour the mood. Problem is, Harriet was not happy about this breakup. She doesn't even understand why they broke up. And Wynne seems like he still has feelings for her. So why did they break up? That's the mystery. And this chapter is told in first person present tense with chapters in the present timeline alternating with chapters of the past when Wynne and Harriet met, when they fell in love. So we're little by little unraveling through the present timeline and going through the past timeline, connecting those two stories together to understand why they broke up. Why couldn't they be together? What's the big conflict here? Before I get into the thick of my feelings here, I want to talk about Emily Henry's writing style because Emily Henry has a very sentimental, ethereal voice. Everything has a color, a smell, a flavor, a texture, a feeling. I felt like the opening of the book, the exposition, felt like I was flipping through a picture book of her memories with her friends. I could see the Polaroids of her with her friends, watching Clueless or wearing funny t-shirts together, having this inside joke about this or that. I could see the laughter, the tears, the joy. I could feel the nostalgia. There was so much flow to her writing, though. I feel like even though we went into these wonderful, rich descriptions that gave you a sense of Harriet's, that gave you a sense of the friendships and the connections there, I felt like it still seamlessly moved forward very well. I feel like Emily Henry never loses her focus in her writing. And I also really enjoyed that the end is somewhat in the same format. It also felt like I was flipping through a picture book. And I enjoyed the friendship dynamics in this story quite a bit. There was such great banter between the friends. They don't always take each other too seriously. They just felt authentic. They felt like realistic friends. What didn't work for me is that the romance in this story highly relies upon the miscommunication trope. And I don't mind the miscommunication trope. I loved Pride and Prejudice. You could argue there is a major miscommunication trope in that story. But in this story, I think why it didn't work is the combination between friends to lovers and miscommunication seemed like a mismatch for me personally. And unpopular opinion here, I don't think I enjoy friends to lovers or that trope very much. Very unpopular opinion on BookTube. If you want to argue with me about this, I am hosting a Why Read discussion this weekend with 2 romance readers, so we could fight it out there in the comments section if you want to. But it didn't work for me in this book, especially because if you have a miscommunication trope, if you're not coming forward and telling people about the conflict, it's hard for me to understand that when there is such a strong basis of friendship underlying your dynamic, when you already have unveiled so much to your partner, you're engaged to your partner. And so I was expecting a very big conflict. And it's not to say that the conflict wasn't real or important. I think that it was a worthwhile conflict. It's one that definitely comes up for some couples, but I didn't feel like it was worth hiding. That I didn't understand at all. So I think, again, friends to lovers plus miscommunication is a really hard combination sell for me. And then I felt like there was another conflict that was brought up later in the book that for me as a reader felt a bit shoehorned in towards the end. I didn't understand why that wasn't brought up earlier in the story. So there were some things with this dynamic, this miscommunication trope, with this conflict between the lovers that I just couldn't quite buy into. And I didn't really feel one way or another about this couple getting together or not, even though I liked both characters quite a bit. So I guess I have unpopular opinions about this book. I know several of my friends have been loving this book, even in my corner of BookTube, which is not very contemporary romance centric. And I would pick up another Emily Henry book in the future. I'm not in an immediate hurry to do so, but I would consider doing so. I think she's a very talented writer. That concludes all the books I read in the month of June. I'll quickly mention that I had a fantastic Why Read episode here with Bookish and Criminale. Had a fantastic time talking with those two channels. A lot of people were talking about how unexpected it was to see those two channels on my channel, but I do lurk around in various corners of BookTube outside my own, and I really have enjoyed those two channels. So it was a fun conversation for me, and I hope they had a good time. And I am looking forward to hearing from you in the comment section below. Let me know what you've been reading, what you've been up to in the month of June. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.